Right.
Well, Lystra is the kind of the famous place where Paul got nailed.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I guess in Christian circles it would be sort of questionable, perhaps scandalous, um, but it was a place that Paul obviously felt very good about. Um, it talks about in Acts 14 how there were there was a healing in Lystra, and importantly, what happened was they started calling um, Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, and these are Greek gods. And so that's how they could relate to this miraculous healing. They had thought that this miracle had occurred, and so therefore the gods had come down. And what happened was Paul told them, "Hey, don't worship us. You know, what are you doing? We're just men like you." And then they basically, these Jews that had been following, they're non-believing Jews that were continually following and harassing Paul, came in there and essentially got the multitude stirred up against them. So here you have on one hand, oh, you're gods, oh no, you're men, oh no, you're not, oh now you're despicable, let's kill you. Boy, you talk about a shift in public opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. This is not going well.
No, it did not go well, and so they stoned Paul, but then um, and they dragged him out of the city, supposing him dead. However, when the disciples, I'm now in Acts 14, verse 20, however, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and so went back in. So what's interesting then, I guess, from that standpoint, is somebody could say, well, you know, wait a minute, did this really occur?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is this sounds, you know, maybe too much to believe or whatever? Was there even a Lystra? Well, there was a Lystra, and it was there was evidence unearthed as early as 1890, and there is a inscription there that refers to the Lystra Colonia, that it was an actual Roman colony. Um, and it right then and there, it just kind of verifies that, okay, there was a Lystra, that at that time it was a Roman colony. We also have, they've got a milestone in another area referring to Lystra. And then lastly, because of this notion that there were pagans there that were worshipers of Greek gods, consistent with trying to say that those two were,
Mm-hmm.
they found foundations of temples dedicated to both Zeus and Hermes, the two very gods that are mentioned, Greek gods that are mentioned
Mm-hmm.
uh, in Acts 14.
Right. Trying to label Paul and Barnabas as those two, and they, you know, they I'll give them this. At least they believed there was God. You know, they said, well, this kind of thing happened. This has to be God that did it. Yeah, the wrong one. But the people of that time frame, I think they had a more um, maybe a clearer picture of, you know, there needs to be gods around, maybe for different reasons. But I just find it interesting that the fact that Paul and Barnabas did these things, and they wanted to assign them to Zeus and Hermes, and that's exactly what we find when we find Lystra, that they are dedicated to those Greek gods, and that's the first thing that came to mind. These are our gods that we worship right here in front of us. These two guys, and those two guys went nuts. So whoa, guys, hold on here a minute. We're not pagan here. So, and I'm quite sure that gave them the chance to talk about Christ, and of course that didn't go over well either, because they took Paul out and stoned him.
Well, and that point I think is important because it goes back to the truth of the gospel message. Here is a man stoned literally to death, or virtually death, And I didn't read that, but they then fled to dirt. He walked back into the city to demonstrate, he
Yeah.
wasn't, they didn't stop him or
Right.
whatever his motivation
I'm
was.
still
And then
here.
they left to go to a different town. The point being is it's further proof of how Paul and the other apostles were constantly being hounded, that they were sharing Jesus to their own personal detriment. There
Yeah.
was nothing in it for them.
No.
There was nothing about the history of the early church centering around power, money,
Oh yeah.
success, prestige, position, none of it. These guys, to their own personal harm, kept proclaiming the Lord Jesus.
Yeah. And when you talk to skeptics about it, that's another thing they'll say. I'm glad you brought that up. Is that the church just wanted power. All they wanted to have was power. Well, if that was the case, then they took the exact wrong road to get it, because they got kicked out of the synagogues. The Jews hated them. They got kicked out of most of the Romans areas. The Romans didn't like them either, and they went around having to declare one of the Caesars gods. And this idea that they had this power trip, that's just silly. Nothing close to that case was really a factor. Now, once it came around 350 or so AD, and Constantine started listening to the Christians for whatever reason he did, they started having a little bit of power then, and maybe they got a little overboard after not having it for quite some time. But when Christians did take over, they did do some good things. They officially ended slavery. It was still around, but it was illegal at that point. Once the Christians took over, Constantine figured, okay, well, I'll listen to them, and they ended slavery. They also, during that time frame, the the people, if they had, I think it was if they had a baby that was a female, they thought it was completely worthless, and they discarded them. The Christians went around picking up those kids and raising them. So the Christians had a good influence, and by the time 350 AD or so came around, they started having some power. But during the time before that, they were on the run for their lives. They had they had to hide. They had to have their churches someplace that wasn't real obvious. They still came to worship, but they didn't do it in a profound manner, because they were after, everybody was after them, just like Paul. Well, Paul, this may be in the time when Paul said that I know someone who went to heaven, and it may have been this event when he got stoned. He actually was really dead. He went to heaven, and apparently God sent him back. Said, no, you're not done yet. So that may have been the same instance where Paul was actually dead, came back to and said no. Jesus said, no, we're not done yet. You're going to be fine. Go back into town and show them you're fine. These are things that I wonder how Paul felt about that. You want me to go back in town again?
Yeah, right.
God sometimes asks us stuff that we don't think is so good idea, but he's always got the reason to do it. Because once I would imagine that once Paul walked back into town after just being stoned, and stoning was not. You see some pictures of it if you look it up. It's a really violent procedure. I've seen places where they dug the person down to the point where they put their arms inside the dirt so they couldn't defend themselves, and they started throwing rocks at them. That was the stoning that I saw, and there's probably other versions of it. But once that happened and the person was dead and he walks back into town, these guys are going to start thinking, well, maybe he's got something going on here. He was the one who killed this lady. We tried to kill him for it, and now he's doing. I don't know what happened to Conium after that, but there could have been some sort of revival there just because Paul took the stoning and walked back in. Um, anyway, yeah, it was interesting. Very interesting stuff.